The story begins with a swirling galaxy of stars and an opening narration in an old woman's voice. She says that love is a small thing in a world ruled by chaos, and that it only takes one moment of bad luck for everything to go completely wrong. Then, a smartly dressed man, Jack, is standing in front of a mirror in a public bathroom. He's talking to himself, muttering under his breath, trying to convince himself that the girl likes him and he can just kiss her. He just has to do it. He repeats to himself that he's spent the whole weekend putting the moment off, and it's now or never. He's very clearly stressed and nervous. When he goes outside to meet his date, Dina, it's dark and they're in the streets of Rome. He puts on an air of total confidence, and she doesn't seem to notice his anxiety. She is concerned that he'll miss his flight, so they hurry as they walk. She laments that his sister Haley got sent to Rome for her work, while she only gets sent to war-torn countries, and he laughs and replies that since she's a war journalist, that's probably pretty much in the job description. They seem to know each other pretty well. They stop by a fountain in a square and gaze at each other for a moment. The air of banter dies down and she smiles at him, saying that when Haley told her Jack would be in town the same weekend as her, this was not how she'd expected the weekend to go. He agrees that it's been a pretty special weekend for them both. There's an awkward tension in the air, and they diffuse it with laughter for a moment before the mood becomes serious again. Their eyes meet and she smiles at him nervously. It's obvious that both want something to happen, but neither is ready to make a move. Jack seems to come to a decision and begins to lean in, finally plucking up the courage to go for it, when they're rudely interrupted by an old school friend of his, Greg. Greg jumps in between the pair, hugging Jack and not reading the mood between them at all. He tells Dina that they used to call Jack Mr. Wank in college, and she wrinkles her nose. Jack is thoroughly embarrassed, but is too polite to tell Greg to leave, and the three of them stand awkwardly by the fountain for a moment, before Jack tells Greg he has to go back to London right now. Greg offers to drive him, thrilled that it looks like they're on the same flight, and regretfully Jack realizes that his excuse didn't work. Dina watches, perplexed, as he agrees to go with Greg, under pressure from his old friend. He asks for a minute to say goodbye to Dina, and Greg tells him to go ahead, but doesn't leave his spot right in between them. He doesn't seem to understand the mood at all. Painfully awkwardly, he offers Dina a handshake, not knowing what else to do in the circumstances, and allows himself to be led away, annoyed with both himself and Greg. Dina watches them leave, utterly confused. The narration cuts over the top of the scene, explaining that this is an example of how chance can sometimes completely kick love to the curb. The story picks up 3 years later, when Jack's sister Haley is in a hotel room getting ready for her wedding. She's grinning at herself in a lacy white dress and bridal makeup, ready for her big day. Her nerves appear to be getting to her, though, despite her excitement, as she soon rushes into another part of the suite, trying to convince herself that everything's going to be fine. Jack is walking down the corridor wearing his tux, and enters Haley's room. She comes back into view, saying that getting married is really stressful. He tells her she looks beautiful, and that calms her down a bit. She talks about Roberto, her Italian husband-to-be, saying she can't believe that it's only been 6 months since they met. Jack shares in her joy, happy for his sister. A moment later, though, she looks down sadly and mentions that she wishes their parents could have been there to celebrate with them. Determined not to let her be sad, Jack tries to cheer her up, but at that moment they're interrupted by the arrival of her maid of honor, her best friend Brian. He asks if he can be called man of honor instead, and she says no, but promises to introduce him to Vitelli, a relative of her fiancé who is casting for his next film. Excited, Brian exclaims that he's going to go and get a haircut because he can't meet Vitelli looking like he does. Both Jack and Haley are shocked, asking him if he really has to do that right now, and he tells them to have faith in him, but neither of them are convinced. As soon as he leaves, Jack professes that he's absolutely, definitely going to be late. He asks Haley about the seating arrangements, and she admits that she had to put all the English speakers on one table together. That means Jack will have to sit next to his ex-girlfriend Amanda. She promises him it'll be fine, but he's not thrilled about it. Amanda and her boyfriend are in a car on the way to the wedding, arguing about the fact that he proposed to her 6 months ago and she hasn't given him an answer yet. They're clearly not in a good place, and she's finding every reason to pick fights with him. Her friend Rebecca greets her as they arrive, asking if she dumped that awful guy Chaz, and then her boyfriend introduces himself as Chaz. Luckily, Rebecca doesn't seem to realize the implication, and says it's mad that Amanda's gone out with 2 men named Chaz in a row. Amanda interrupts the awkward moment by calling over another friend, Sydney. They all head in together, with Chaz furiously asking her who this other guy is. None of the group seem to be very intelligent. Jack and Haley pull up outside. She's tearful, and pauses for a moment before they get out of the car. She turns to Jack and sobs that she would have given anything for their father to be there, but she's really glad he's going to be walking her down the aisle. The guests are all waiting on the lawn for the wedding to begin. But as expected, Brian is late. Haley is panicking a little bit, but she sees her fiancé across the garden, and smiles, telling Jack she's ready to go. Just before they walk out, though, Haley remembers that she'd forgotten to tell Jack that Dina would be at the wedding. She's broken up with her boyfriend recently. Jack is stunned, asking 100 questions, clearly nervous at the thought of seeing her again, but refocuses his attention on Haley and walks her down the aisle. Brian arrives half a second after the vicar starts speaking, rushing in from behind him and standing beside Haley, asserting that he told them he'd make it in time. After the ceremony, everyone is mingling in the garden. Amanda and Chaz are with Rebecca, who's complimenting Chaz's suit, which Amanda hates. Sydney, Amanda's friend, finds Dina and strikes up a conversation with her. She asks him why he's wearing a kilt if he's not Scottish, and he doesn't have an answer. Then he asks her if she has a boyfriend and she replies no, so he offers to become wedding buddies since they're both there solo. Dina's a little taken aback and tries to refuse a drink, but Sydney insists on fetching her one, and she sighs as he walks away. Meanwhile, Brian is freaking out over his only chance to meet and impress the director Vitelli, one of Roberto's relatives. He's a struggling actor who desperately wants his shot at being in his next film. Jack tells him he will have a chance with his speech later, but Brian didn't realize he had to make a speech and starts freaking out more. Jack's trying to calm him down when Rebecca approaches, and Brian begs Jack not to leave him alone with her because she's so clingy. Despite Brian's pleas, though, he sees Dina standing alone where Sydney left her, and immediately takes the opportunity to leave the conversation and go to find her. Dina's very pleased to see him, but he's totally tongue-tied by how beautiful she looks. Meanwhile, Chaz is staring jealously up at Jack, lamenting that Amanda used to date him and going on and on about how much better he is than Jack. Amanda, tired of Chaz's irritating manner, shoos him away. Meanwhile, they are taking wedding photos, and Roberto asks Haley if she's okay. She kisses Roberto sweetly, telling him that absolutely nothing could spoil her day. At that moment, a car pulls up with a man, Mark, in the back. He's obviously high, stumbling around, and downs an entire glass of champagne on his way in. Haley spies him from the window and curses, excusing herself from Roberto's family and going to confront her wedding crasher. He professes that he's here now and she doesn't have to go through with it, that he's ready to be a couple with her, but horrified, she tries to escort him out. Just as she's about to call security on him, Roberto shows up and introduces himself, unaware of Mark's intentions. Haley tells him Mark was just leaving, but wanting to accommodate his wife's friend, he says he'll make room and leads him back into the wedding. Haley swears under her breath, really not wanting Mark to be there, but unable to say anything without causing a scene. Meanwhile, Jack and Dina are taking a walk around. She's explaining how her boyfriend cheated on her and that she decided to come to the wedding last minute after she found out. Jack stops her in the hallway and, bashfully, says he's always been asking Haley about how she's doing, and she admits she did the same. They're about to share a moment when Haley appears in a panic, dragging Jack away to deal with the Mark situation. Unwillingly, he goes with her, leaving Dina alone once again. Haley explains to Jack that Mark showed up, high, and telling her he's in love with her. She can't get rid of him now because he's so volatile and she doesn't want anything to go wrong. She asks if Jack will put her sleeping medication into Mark's champagne to knock him out so he won't ruin the day. Jack refuses, saying she's mental and he's not going to drug someone, but Haley begs him to do it so she won't be humiliated in front of her whole new family. Roberto comes to take Haley away for more photos, and Jack is left with the sleeping solution, which against his better judgment he surreptitiously puts into the glass by Mark's new nameplate. As soon as he does, though, some children come in and move all the nameplates around. Due to the children's meddling, Brian is seated beside Rebecca, who is still clinging onto him. Unfortunately, Jack and Dina are across the table from each other. Jack notices something's up and switches the drinks over, but takes the wrong glass and it ends up at Brian's seat. Sydney is sitting beside Dina and is still trying to lay the charm on her, even though she's obviously uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Chaz is on Rebecca's other side while Amanda is next to Jack, and Chaz is getting annoyed that she won't ignore the place cards and sit with him. Rebecca doesn't help by recounting that Jack and Amanda used to have such a physical relationship, making Chaz even more jealous and insecure. Jack and Dina are looking at each other across the table, but unable to interact, separately in their own awful conversations. Sydney is asking Dina what she does for a living, and insults her for being careless while she's telling the story of how she got kidnapped by the Taliban during the course of one of her reports. He interrupts her midway to talk about himself. Meanwhile, Brian is telling Jack he has to take his chance with Dina this time. Dina catches his eye and mouths for him to help her out of her conversation. Seizing his moment, Jack asks Brian to watch Mark for him to make sure he doesn't go anywhere. Brian, though, is already mostly asleep, having been drugged by the sleeping solution. As soon as Jack and Dina leave the table, followed by the unshakable Sydney, Mark gets up and walks off. At that moment, Brian decides to go to Vitelli's table and introduce himself. He's under the influence of the drugs, though, and is trying hard not to fall asleep while the director is talking. Vitelli is clearly disturbed by him and doesn't really understand what's going on. Brian gets back to his table, and Rebecca asks him how it went, and he affirms that he thinks it went really well. Meanwhile, Jack is trying to find a moment to talk to Dina alone, and eventually has to ask Sydney if he wouldn't mind giving them a minute. When they finally get to speak, the spark is still there between them, just as it was 3 years ago, and he's relieved that he's finally getting the chance to catch up with her properly. She's had a rough 3 years between her job, her cheating boyfriend, and her mother's death. Jack hopes for good luck for her from now on, and there's a strong unspoken feeling in the air between them. Unsupervised, Mark is doing in the bathroom, getting high and convincing himself that he's going to win Haley's heart. He finds her and pulls her away from her conversation, threatening that if she doesn't break up with Roberto, he'll do it for her. Haley is called away for the first dance and tells him again to leave. After, she drags Jack outside and yells at him for failing to put Mark to sleep. He's confused, saying he doesn't know how it didn't work. Neither of them have noticed that Brian took the drugged glass. Chaz catches Jack on his way back in, threatening him and telling him to stay away from Amanda, totally insecure about Amanda's relationship with him and the fact they were sitting together at dinner. Jack readily agrees, saying he doesn't like Amanda at all, and walks away totally confused. He returns to Dina, but then sees Mark greeting Roberto and has to leave her to forcibly drag him away. Jack pulls Mark into a hallway, telling him to leave Haley alone. Mark rebuts him, proclaiming proudly that he and Haley slept together 3 weeks ago, and she can't be happy with her husband if she cheated on him. Surprised by the new information, but loyal to his sister, Jack commits to keeping Mark away, and drags him bodily into a closet, helped by Sydney, whom he finds lingering in the corridor, after failing to introduce himself to a woman called Christina. Jack confronts Haley about what Mark said, and she tries to lie to him, but he sees through her. Embarrassed and ashamed, she admits it's true, that it happened when she went back to London before the wedding. She says she loves Roberto more than anything, and he can never find out what happened. Before they can resolve it, the maid of honor's speech is announced. They rush back to find Brian asleep at the table. Frantically, Jack escorts him, stumbling, up to the stage, but he's still very much affected by the drugs and forgets what he's doing there. He thinks he's in a dream, addresses Vitelli asking for a part, and then to the shock of everyone, runs over to the cake and eats some. Haley puts her head in her hands, mortified, as Jack leads Brian out. Meanwhile, a guest discovers Mark in the closet and frees him, and Dina receives a message from work and has to leave early. Jack rushes over to see her before she goes. As he's about to confess his feelings for her, though, Amanda and Chaz approach. Amanda headbutts Jack as retaliation for saying he doesn't like her, then tells Chaz she'll marry him and storms off. Dina, shocked, has to leave Jack alone on the floor with a bleeding nose. Mark gets up on stage, grabs the mic and tells the whole wedding that he and Haley slept together. She screams, rushes up and drags him off, beating him senselessly, but the damage is already done. Roberto asks her if it's true, and she begins to cry, distraught, and runs after him begging him to talk to her. He's incensed, though, and sits down on the wall at the edge of the terrace, telling her it's over and he never wants to see her again. She reaches out to him, tears streaking down her face, and he loses his balance and falls over the edge. Then, everything stops. The old woman's narration comes back, saying that by chance, things could have been different. Time rewinds back to the table, with the 8 name cards in different places after the children mess with them. One scenario after another plays out depending on where everyone is sitting. When Rebecca drinks the drugged drink, Mark is offering Sydney drugs, Chaz proposes to Amanda, and Jack carries a drunk Dina over his shoulder. When Dina drinks the drugged drink, when it's Sydney, Amanda and Haley have a furious argument. When it's Mark, Sydney and Brian are taking photos with his slumped-over form while Jack and Dina break up in front of them. In every single scenario, chaos reigns, and in the end, everyone ends up unhappy, except in the one timeline where everything goes right and the table placements are exactly the way they were supposed to originally be. The thread picks up as everyone sits down at the table once again, this time in their properly assigned places. Jack and Dina are beside each other, and Amanda and Chaz are beside each other. The only difference is, Jack is the one with the drugged drink this time. He downs his champagne without realizing, and then instantly notices the taste, swears, and jumps up from the table, running off to the bathroom to try and make himself sick. Brian follows him, and unable to make himself throw up, Jack begs Brian to stick his fingers down his throat for him. Brian is reluctant, but agrees, only because Jack promises him it'll save Haley's wedding. Dina walks in on Jack and Brian just as Brian's hand is down Jack's throat, and entirely misunderstands what she's seeing. Both men stand up, speechless, and wordlessly follow her back to the table. Jack asks her to forget what she just saw and promises her there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for it, and she decides to agree and put it behind her until he can tell her the full story. She opens up to him about her mother dying and the bad years she's had, but he falls asleep while she's talking, and angry, she gets up and leaves the table. In this scenario, when the handsome Vitelli goes to sit down beside Dina at the bar, instead Sydney gets in the way, and Dina indulges him, ordering shots to forget about the terrible afternoon she's having. Amanda comes over to the table and tries to wake Jack up, telling him Chaz asked her to marry him, and he nods sleepily and congratulates her. She slaps him in the face and walks off, which luckily wakes him up just enough to see that Mark is approaching Roberto. This time, when Jack drags him off, he's drugged and unable to keep Mark under control. Mark leaves Jack in the hallway, dozing off, for Brian to find him. Brian drags him outside and wakes him up forcefully. Jack thanks him, tired, but determined that he needs to be awake, and that he has to help Haley. Brian comments that Jack's always helping her, getting her out of messes, and that sooner or later he has to start putting himself first. He's always ending up last because he looks out for others. Still affected by the drugs, Jack puts his arm around Brian, professing that he loves him more than just a normal friend, then promptly falls asleep again. Haley figures out that Jack took the sedative and pulls him into the garden, slapping him awake. He complains that everyone's hitting him today. She tearfully confesses that Mark is going to tell Roberto she slept with him. She breaks down, weeping, saying that she messes everything up because she's a total loser, and Jack comforts her, promising that even if Roberto can't forgive her, then he'll still be there for her, and they can be losers together. She hugs him tight, and he confesses that he thinks they're both too afraid to let a relationship happen because they know how hard it is to lose loved ones. Meanwhile, Dina is listening to Sydney talk about his work while they both down shots. She leaves, saying she needs to go to bed. Brian finds Rebecca sitting alone on a couch and sits beside her, deciding to finally clear the air between them. He asks why she likes him, and she confirms that although he's an idiot, she just kind of likes him for being who he is. He freezes, looking over at her, suddenly seeing her in a whole new light, because nobody has ever been so honest and said that they like him for his personality. They lock eyes for a long moment, Rebecca feeling a little bit shy and unsure of herself after voicing her feelings, and Brian calculating whether he should make a move. Then, he abruptly grabs her and kisses her passionately. It's heady, but they break apart, both not quite sure what just happened, muttering awkwardly to each other. Neither of them knows quite what to do. Then Rebecca timidly asks if she can go again, and they're suddenly engaged in an embrace even more torrid than the last, clambering over each other on the couch, forgetting everything else around them as they kiss. Mark is in the bathroom, getting high and preparing for the moment when he'll ruin the wedding. This time, Jack arrives in time and catches him. He tells Mark that Haley's happy with Roberto and begs him to let her go, if he really, truly does care about her. Mark walks off, and exhausted, Jack sits back down at the table just as Sydney approaches, asking him for advice on speaking to women. He says he thinks he might be boring, and Jack falls asleep again while he's talking. Sydney gets up and makes to leave, but in a fit of pity, Jack drags him back, telling him to just listen to others once in a while, and he'll have more luck. The maid of honor speech is announced, and Brian jumps up from where he and Rebecca are kissing under the couch and sprints up to the stage. He makes a rousing speech about love, inspired by his tryst, and wishing Haley and Roberto will last forever. Everyone is enraptured, and as Brian heads back to Rebecca, nobody notices Mark stepping forward. He steps up to the mic, but sees her and Roberto, and at the last minute, remembers Jack's words and instead of ruining the wedding, decides instead to wish them happiness. Haley runs after him on the way out, letting him know she's grateful that he didn't spill the beans. Later, Chaz finds Amanda at the bar and tells her that he thinks maybe they shouldn't get married, because she's clearly not in love with him. She says that someone is going to be lucky to have him one day, and he thanks her for her words, leaving with tears in his eyes. Sydney spots Christina at the bar, and this time, he takes care to ask her about her job and listen carefully to what she's saying, following Jack's advice. Brian and Rebecca are sitting together at their table, Rebecca curled up in Brian's arms. In this timeline, it seems that everyone except for Jack and Dina have had a happy ending. Dina receives the message from work saying she has to leave, and Jack runs after her on her way out, knowing that she's still angry at him for falling asleep while she was talking about her mother's death, but determined to finally take the chance. She listens while he confesses that he was going to kiss her that night in Rome 3 years ago, and he's never felt a connection with anyone else like he has with her. He asks her if she feels the same, but she says that although he's not imagining the spark, they missed their moment, and walks away, needing to catch a flight to Mexico. Depressed, Jack returns to the bar to find Brian. He questions how things happened with Rebecca, and Brian laughs sheepishly. He tells him he's going to give up acting. At that moment, Vitelli approaches him and says he was moved by his speech, and hands him his card to call his assistant for an audition the next day. Overjoyed, Brian instantly forgets his resolution, and Jack grins, saying he's glad that at least one of them got lucky. Brian says that every person is lucky just to have been born. Everything comes down to chance, and life is about grabbing the moments as they come. Jack thinks about his friend's words, and realizes that he can't let Dina walk away again. He jumps up and rushes out of the bar, running down the street to find her before she gets in a cab. He encounters her waiting for her ride, and she's confused at first. But then he steps closer, making his intentions clear, and she turns to face him, captivated by the emotion between them. Just as he leans in to finally seal their kiss, a voice calls Dina's name, an old acquaintance she met at a party once. He goes in to hug her, but Jack firmly orders him to leave, not letting chance get in the way of them being together again. He kisses her deeply, and the final pair of lovers find their happy ending.